FaceWorks is really a breakthrough piece of work. And, well, let's show it to you. This is digital IRA. IRA is not a recording. IRA is being processed in real time on a GPU called the Titan. Just mathematically, it takes about 8,000 instructions, 8,000 instruction long program to articulate the geometry, all of the meshes, and all of the pixel processing necessary for each and every pixel. Each one, the 8,000 instructions, call it 5 floating point operations per instruction, 40,000 ops per pixel. Multiply that by, call it half the screen of HD, and multiply that by 60 hertz, and you get something along the lines of about 2 teraflops, which is about half of the performance necessary by Titan.
Hey there guys, my name's Anthony, and a question that I always ponder after reading comments so often dropped off by deluded Nintendo diehard fanboys is just how powerful is the Nintendo Switch really, when compared to last gen? And by extension, just how much farther ahead is the Switch in comparison to the PlayStation Vita? Well, buckle up friends and foes, because we're going to use one of the most oft-cited metrics to figure out today, once and for all, how powerful the Nintendo Switch really is. So to start us off, there are nearly unlimited numbers of ways to speculate exactly how powerful these systems are in relation to one another, and seeing as how the most vocal of the online gaming community since around 2013 or so cares so much about frame rates and resolutions, I thought it would only make sense to focus mostly on those metrics and to draw conclusions from that. But not in just any old wishy-washy crazy subjective way either. Instead, I've decided to focus on a couple of select PS3 games and compare their frame rates and resolutions to closely matching Switch and Vita games. Why PS3 and not Xbox 360? Because I owned a PS3 longer and played more games on it. And, well, that's pretty much it. There's no agenda going on here, I just have more games on the PlayStation 3. I got Halo and Forza and the Gears series. That's pretty much all I have for the Xbox 360. Seriously, just the essentials. But that doesn't mean you can't use the following methodology to compare games on the Xbox 360 across other platforms. That's fine, you can do that. And do your own pixel counting or take resources from relatively trustworthy places, like Digital Foundry or NX Gamer, or even Candyland if, I'm not sure they do frame rate, or they don't do resolutions, but, you know, they do pretty much everything else. Just know that comparing third-party software across those systems might yield strange results, especially if you start comparing the last batch of games made by third-party developers. Alrighty, so how exactly do we compare hardware on such a huge scale, and how accurate are these measurements going to be? To compare across platforms, we first need to set some ground rules for the quality of software we'll be using for comparisons. First, we need to find some really demanding games for each platform that also look phenomenal and run well. So I see we've hit our first speed bump. Just what do I mean by phenomenal? Well, I mean games with tons of graphical details that also push complex and demanding visuals and demand loads of CPU usage. Now, how do we know a game is taxing on a CPU and GPU? Well, here are a few examples of complex GPU-related rendering features. Volumetric lights, large number of particles that are transparent and animated, or animated sprites that receive light and cast shadows. High-resolution shadows, spaces loaded with tons of fully dynamic lights, smooth motion blur without a lot of gradients in it, that is. High-resolution screen space reflections, or just really any type of reflections that require some sort of, planar reflections are pretty complex. So there's a few examples there. High-resolution textures, a high-resolution output, and so on and so forth. And here are some examples of processes that demand a lot from a CPU, like really smart AI that know what the player is up to and know how to challenge the player. Context-sensitive animations, as well as very smooth blending between different animations. High-quality physics that are applied to tons of things in any given scene that don't visibly bounce off cushions of air or fall through the ground or clip through any part of the environment. And things like sound processing, reverb, object raycasting for sounds, high frame rates, and again, so on and so forth. When we've narrowed down the selection of games using these rules, we can start to look at other things like the metrics that we need. So we have frame rates, and we also have resolution so far. That's what we're looking at right now. But since, in this case, we really just want to challenge the hardware as much as we possibly can to get the most representative comparisons, we can't look at newer hardware in some cases when comparing systems that are too distant with regards to technical capabilities. There are some limits when comparing some hardware. This isn't the best way to compare, for example, say an Xbox One to an Atari 2600. So we need to focus on software made for a similar level of hardware to keep away from apples to oranges comparisons. Since we're focusing on comparing any hardware within certain technical limits using resolutions and frame rates, as well as a few other things, we need to eliminate as many other variables as possible to make this as accurate as possible by focusing on games that really push hardware to the brink of catastrophic failure. We should be able to create a pretty decent estimate about how much more or less powerful one system is in reference to another. On consoles, this should be slightly easier than trying to compare PCs, but technically it's possible. And that's because the hardware's life cycle runs its course, and we see better and better software until the developers stop supporting it. And since last gen lasted 8 years, we know that the hardware and software engineers were being stretched to their breaking points working within the hardware's constraints. Another important factor is making sure our comparisons are valid, which means we also need to cull games that are clearly poorly optimized. Games like PUBG, The Mighty Number 9, and Ark Survival Evolved, all being able to run on Xbox One X without any issue, for sure, but still run like corn kernel-filled dog crap on frozen grass, which to say very, very poorly. Given that hardware's capabilities, it's pretty clear that much less than decent optimizations were deployed in the early days of PUBG. Basically, poor optimization is knowing that software cannot reasonably be taxing on any particular piece of hardware. And we know that by primarily looking at other examples of better looking and or performing software on the same hardware. Say what you will about the Xbox One family Olymp exclusive catalog, but there is absolutely no way that a game like PUBG or State of Decay 2 should have such erratic and ultimately slow performance, especially when there are so much better looking games in similar genres running on the same hardware, okay? I don't understand. Why is this a thing? Anyway, signs of good optimization are typically indicated by functionally snappy controls and above all else stable performance. But as stated earlier, we need games that show off the hardware's weaknesses a bit, so using games like Trine 2, Rayman, or Cinemora X aren't going to give us realistic performance estimates simply because most of the stuff being done is so unbelievably far away from being vaguely challenging to the hardware that the sum of those metrics would put far weaker hardware toe-to-toe or even ahead of what we know is clearly way more capable hardware. Alright, first let's see what happens when we break the above rules and compare games on weaker systems to much more powerful systems, exclusively using resolutions and frame rates. Take, for example, Super Mario Odyssey on Switch compared to Ratchet & Clank on PS4. So, we basically wind up with Switch being 40% more powerful than a base model PS4. Wait, what? How the did I come to that conclusion? We know Switch is not more powerful than PS4, but by focusing solely on resolutions and frame rates, we lose a lot of detail. So, what did I do there? It's pretty simple. With a game like Super Mario Odyssey, that game runs at 1600 by 900, and they do everything in their power to make sure that that game is running at 60 frames per second. So, we need 1600 multiplied by 900, and that gives us the pixel area, and then we have the actual frame rate, and we multiply that, and we end up with 86,400,000 pixels being drawn. Now, of course, compare that to 1920 by 1080 times just 30 frames per second for a game like, Ratchet & Clank. And now we can just divide the smaller number by the larger number. Well, basically, we wind up with Switch being about 72% as powerful as a base model PS4. Yeah, that's just the math there. Just the math on the resolutions, frame rates. That's not the only thing that we're looking at, though. So, as you can see, 900p at 60 frames per second draws more pixels to the screen than 1080p at 30 frames per second. And this is Why some people think the Nintendo Switch is more powerful? Basically because they don't know jack crap about hardware, and there's a lot of differences between Super Mario Odyssey and Wolfenstein 2. And it's why Super Mario Odyssey is running at 900p 60 frames per second, whereas Wolfenstein 2 is struggling with very low resolutions and possibly using checkerboard resolution on top of that. On top of being at such an obscenely low resolution, resolutions that are lower than Killzone Mercenary on the PlayStation Vita. It's a little crazy. On PlayStation 3 and Vita, there's no shortage of games that have, let's say, flawed performance. And there are a number of games that also feature variable rendering resolutions like Wipeout HD as well. Alright, I've talked enough already, and I know you're eager to get to the comparisons now. For this particular comparison, I'll be using Killzone 2, Killzone 3, Killzone Mercenary, Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, across PlayStation 3, Vita, Switch, and as a bonus, I'll be adding a comparison of Killzone Shadowfall and Wolfenstein 2 on PS4 against the Switch, just for good measure. So, why did I select these games? Well, you can skip back to the beginning for the details in case you fell asleep, but in summary, these games push their respective hardware to their limits on 2 of 3 of the most important internal components to many gamers, the CPU and GPU, and they'll all show frame rate instabilities on their respective systems, while having well-known output resolutions, and to top it off, as an added bonus, they're all games in the same genre. They don't really need to be, as I mentioned earlier, but it's kind of nice that they are in this particular case, I guess, because you can actually see how similar they look to one another. But in the case of these few games, we also know a lot about the triangle counts for models, as well as estimates regarding per-frame triangle counts amongst other important rendering features, like whether or not deferred rendering is being used. In the case of Killzone, we know the developers mean business when it comes to delivering impressive visuals, and their latest game for PS3 was released in 2011, with their previous work on that platform being released way back in 2009. Holy crap. That doesn't make you feel old. Anyway, that game wasn't just chilling out. It looks like a serious hardware crusher, and its visuals still hold up really well even now. Meanwhile, Guerrilla Cambridge developed Killzone Mercenary, which released in 2012 for PlayStation Vita, and the developers deployed a dynamic frame buffer allowing Vita to achieve native resolution so long as the player and camera weren't moving. But it only scales, apparently, along the horizontal axis. So we need the lowest and highest known internal rendering resolutions, as well as the lowest, highest, and average frame rates of all the games in question, plus a basic knowledge of how the games operate. Killzone 2 is a 720p game running at 30 frames per second, and it kind of bottoms out at around like 22 frames per second or something, but most of the time it stays at around 25 frames per second on an average. So that's what we're going to be using. Killzone 3 looks a bit better than Killzone 2 and has a few additional features. While retaining everything from the previous title, it also renders at a native 720p at 30 frames per second. Again, FPS is somewhat variable, but it's closer to 30 frames per second. So we can use something on the top end there, 28 to 30 frames per second. You can fiddle around with those, but again, if you use something radically crazy, insane, low, like 1 frame per second, then you're not really going to get an accurate estimate. Although you could also just use the resolutions and the geometry counts, and we'll try that. But anyway, Wolfenstein 2 on Switch is 720p with dynamic resolution frame buffer. That can dip all the way down to 640 by 360. But Digital Foundry states that in docked mode, the game runs closer to 720p, but hardly ever hits that bare minimum HD resolution. This game also targets 30 frames per second and maintains it for the majority of play, even in some pretty intense scenes. The frame rate is relatively flat, except where major series of explosions are concerned, but that is rare, and will be a little bit charitable to the Nintendo Switch and say the game runs at a flat 30 frames per second, at about an 80% resolution. Okay. Killzone Mercenary runs at quarter full HD, which is a really fancy way of saying 960 by 544 pixels, with a dynamic resolution that scales only on the horizontal axis, and the bottom resolution of that horizontal scaling is 480 pixels. It does seem that the PlayStation Vita version, I've done my own pixel counts using tons of screenshots, and for the most part, they are at a full resolution, 960 by 544, and it just seems to toggle between the two resolutions. So every screen grab that I was able to get where there is movement, basically it just drops by half. So if there's too much stuff going on, actually. I have to be clear about that. There has to be a lot of stuff going on. It does seem to toggle between the two resolutions without any real grade between them. So even when you are moving, even when the camera is moving and stuff, sometimes it will be at 960 by 544, which is pretty crazy. But it seems every screen grab that I have is either a full 960 by 544 or a lower resolution. And it's very weird because you can just pan the camera and stuff like that and not really get that lower resolution. I've seen some screen grabs that I have seem to have something that looks like there's motion blur applied to it, but it's still rendering at 960 by 544. I'm not even sure that game has motion blur. Does it? It seemed like some of the screenshots that I had motion blur, but whatever. But anyway, the game's frame rate is what suffers. Okay, so it does take a hit there compared to the PS3 version. So we'll say it's around 25 frames per second, just because we sort of can, and I don't actually have any real performance metrics. It does seem to drop as low as 18 frames per second. I think Digital Foundry was they did some tests and they were looking at it. And I mean, the frame rate can be pretty choppy. In multiplayer, it seems pretty good, which is kind of weird, especially since there'd be more CPU-related stuff going on. And the levels, they haven't taken a hit in visual quality. They're very detailed. You know, it's the most detailed game basically on the PlayStation Vita, period, just bar none. Well, I mean, I guess the closest we have is actually Wipeout 2048. It uses a dynamic frame buffer as well, and it goes low. Wow. I think they actually dropped by 50% rather, on both axes. But I can't be sure of that because there's no way to actually take a screenshot of Wipeout 2048 using the system. And unfortunately, my particular copy of Wipeout 2048 does not work on any of my PlayStation Vitas. So now we have Killzone Shadowfall on a base model PS4. It runs at 1080p and an unlocked frame rate that tops out at 60, but sticks far closer to 30 frames per second. So we'll say it's 30 frames per second. It can go higher, but Digital Foundry did some tests and stuff, and they're looking at it. The very opening scene where you're trying to escape, and also the other large forest level in the opening of the game. You know, very wide open draw distance. You can see the city and all that stuff. There's, you know, all sorts of stuff going on. And the game is basically running at a locked 30 frames per second. They did, 40 minutes of video, basically. And it's just basically locked at 30 frames per second. So we'll say it's 30 frames per second. Wolfenstein 2 on PS4 runs at a locked 1080p according to Digital Foundry's analysis, despite having a dynamic resolution on Xbox One, and even, in the worst of cases, lingers briefly at around 55 frames per second on a PS4. Basically, the frame rate's nearly locked to 60. So we'll just say that it's 1080p 60. So with those figures, we can start calculating how many pixels these systems are outputting to get hardware estimates just like Jensen Huang did. If you don't know who he is, and you love the Nintendo Switch and Tegra X1 hardware, I really don't know what's wrong with you. So way back in 2013, Jensen Huang actually used a particular calculation. He did like a run-of-the-mill sort of calculation. Probably did this, back of the envelope sort of stuff, and then remembered to put that in the teleprompter so he could read it or something like that. Maybe he just remembered it offhand, but what he did is basically what I'm doing here. He looked at how much is going on in the software and what the hardware is capable of handling and stuff like that. He calculated the resolution and how many pixels are being updated and all that, and he's basically saying, the Titan, we built it to do things like this, to make digital IRA a reality. This was talking about FaceWorks specifically. So you could actually just go to NVIDIA's YouTube channel, and toward the end of that video is when they actually show off the tech, and that's when he actually does the calculations, and here it is as well. In case they remove that, because people have been doing this sort of stuff for a long time. They've been making estimates, and this is basically my version to compare all these different platforms, and it seems to make sense based on what I've looked at. Alright, so how are we going to do it? So as I mentioned, Wolfenstein is running with a dynamic resolution, and Digital Foundry notes this. Pretty much everybody says that it's a blurry game. So in this case, we can assume, based on its presentation, that it's hardly ever hitting a native 720p, and also based on Digital Foundry's analysis and other people's assessment. So while it trends higher, let's just say that the resolution sticks pretty closely to around 80%, which is still pretty good. That's higher, 75% would be half. That would be in between, right? You have 720p, you have 50%, which is 640. Instead of going to 75%, we're going to use 80, which is closer to the native resolution. So I'm being favorable. And we're also sticking, again, to 30 frames per second. So, on this, basically that's 1024 times 576 pixels times 30 frames per second. Okay, that's the calculation we've hit for the Nintendo Switch, just on the face of it. Okay, which gives us roughly 17.7 million pixels. All right, it's crazy. That's a lot of pixels to be drawing per second, and that's with everything else that is being drawn. Meanwhile, on PlayStation 3, Killzone 2 is locked to 720p, but plays at 25 frames per second on average. So we can actually do that. 1280 times 720 times 25, and we end up with like 23.04 million. Actually, there's no other numbers there, so yeah. 23.04 million pixels per frame or second. Okay, and the formula just looks exactly like I stated it does. On Switch, there you go, and on Killzone 2. Then you divide the larger number into the smaller number, which is, in this case, the PS3, and then we divide the Switch number. And this is how we find out how much more powerful PlayStation 3 is. It's basically 30% faster, right? Okay, and we can, I guess, just do the smaller number by the larger number, and what we end up with is the system being basically, 33%, 76%. It's running at 76%, right? But that's only looking at frame rates and resolutions. So the Switch would be, in this very favorable case, 76% as fast as the PlayStation 3. But it, unfortunately, gets a little bit worse for the Nintendo Switch. Killzone 3 looks and runs better, and as a result, PS3 gains appear greater, still at a higher quality here. So we're going to go with 720p 30, because it doesn't go higher than that. And then we can take the Switch number, which was the 17 something, and PlayStation 3 ends up being about 56% more powerful, and basically the Switch looks to be about 64% as fast as the PlayStation 3. I'm not sure how that works out, like my brain doesn't like doing that sort of back the envelope calculation, but if you want to find out, PS3 over Switch, and you'll find out how much more powerful it is, and then you do Switch over PS3, and you find out how much weaker the Switch is. Basically, that's how that works. Okay, so Switch being basically 64% as fast as a PlayStation 3 seems wrong, right? Well, when you think back to when Sony claimed PS4 is 10 times more powerful than the PS3, what do I mean by that, right? Looking at Killzone Shadowfall and Wolfenstein 2 on PS4, we see huge gains on PS4 over PS3 at just 225%, but that's quite clearly not 10 times better. And even Wolfenstein 2, this effectively just doubles to 450% when you factor in that it's running at 60 frames per second rather than 30. So what's the problem here? What gives? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are other factors at play, including stuff that isn't really noticeable to the player, such as increases in geometry. Yes, I know. And especially at lower resolutions, you're not actually going to notice as much. But we do sort of have to factor that in. And Killzone 2 and 3 had much lower poly counts than Killzone Shadowfall and Wolfenstein 2. According to this article on Kotaku, which is in the description box, here, I quote, "In Killzone 3, the average character model had around 10,000 polygons. That number has jumped out to 40,000 on the PlayStation 4. End quote. But we can safely assume that characters weren't the only things that saw significant quality improvements when going from PS3 to PlayStation 4. Adding 3 times more geometry to many meshes in addition to increasing the number of NPCs on screen definitely has an impact on the visuals, the performance, and also this particular formula. We can factor this change in geometry as geometry calculations haven't changed much from gen to gen. And in the case of Killzone, the way the engine renders these things also hasn't radically changed, to my knowledge at least. So 2.25 times 4 is 9, which is far closer to that 10 times jump Sony claimed exists between the PS3 and PS4. Killzone on Vita will also be an overestimate because of these kinds of differences. As an example, if we use the knowledge we learned from Digital Foundry's interviews with the developer of Killzone Mercenary and the blurriness of some screenshots, we can assume that the horizontal scaling goes down to 50% on the horizontal axis. This puts Switch ahead of the Vita by a healthy 70%, but we know that Vita struggles with geometry. But by how much? Well, this video, in the description box, claims Vita hardware is able to push about half as many polygons as the PS3. This information from an actual asset artist for Killzone Mercenary kind of backs that up pretty well. So we can slash Vita's numbers by 50%, which allows Switch to soar ahead of Vita with a whopping 340% performance lead. So that sounds about right. Basically, Switch is about 3 times as powerful as PlayStation Vita. But Vita is still half as powerful as the PlayStation 3, and by extension, so is Switch. And all practical applications and games on the Shield TV also show performance and resolution deficits compared to PS3, with Doom 3 BFG Edition being that sole exception. So where does Switch stand compared to PS4? Using the same metrics as before, Switch running Wolfenstein 2 at 80% resolution and 30 frames per second compared to the PS4 at 1080p 60 leaves us with a straight 700% performance lead in favor of PS4, assuming geometry is only 75% of PS4's output in the equation here. If we adjust for the actual difference in geometry between Switch and PS4, Switch ends up being about 3% as fast as a PS4. However, Switch has advantages, like FP16, that make the difference appear to be much closer to around 1/10 the power of the PS4. But remember that while this game is pretty similar, we don't know that much about the Switch hardware, namely the Tegra X1 SoC. All we have to go on is speculation here. Even in the Tegra X1 white paper, estimates about how much geometry the chip can render is non-existent, and trust me, I looked. Basically, what we see in all examples to date regarding games on Tegra X1 hardware is a significant reduction in geometry compared to PS3 and Xbox 360. This is definitely true of Wolfenstein 2 on Switch, given that last gen was also running games with total poly counts anywhere between 1 and 2 million polygons per frame. If Tegra X1 is only capable of pumping out around 75% of the geometry that PS3 was per frame, then the performance differential increased drastically to well over 3,700%. This, given that it is only an estimate, makes some sense given that in the absolute worst case scenario, going between resolutions and frame rates alone, Switch sits roughly at 1/18th the compute power of a PlayStation 4. So, I mean, in comparison to PS4, this is how it goes. PS3 is roughly 10% as fast, Switch is roughly 7% as fast, and PS Vita is close to 3% as fast. And they're out